at seam finishes, we're going to work some seam finishes, but before we work seam finishes, I wanted to talk about why we do seam finishes and where you see them. So the inside of the garment is just as important as the outside, and on the inside of the garment you want to see a nice neat appearance, and so you're going to finish every seam that you do so that that is a nice appearance on the inside. We're going to look at 3 different seam finishes. We'll do a stitched and pinked seam finish, we'll do a zigzag seam finish, and we'll do a serged seam finish. So a serged seam finish is the most common seam finish, and you see that here in this blouse, and it's just an overcast edge, and you do it with a special machine called the serger. So we'll look at that. The other seam finish that I want to show you an example of is the stitched and pinked seam finish, and you can see that this is a vintage dress, and so that would tell you that this is a seam finish that you see in maybe some older garments that were made. You see a row of stitches, and then you see a pinked edge, and the pinked edge will not fray so easily, but when it does, it will only fray to the end of that where the stitches are. So a stitched and pink seam finish and a serged seam finish. And then I wanted to remind you, another reason that we do these is sometimes it will extend the life of the garment, not to have raveling and fraying going on. So that's a second reason, aside from the appearance. And then it will add strength. A lot of times this seam finish will make the seam stronger. So that's another reason that we do seam finishes. So we'll look at seam finishes. For the zigzag seam finish, we're gonna choose the second setting on your machine, which is the zigzag stitch. Then this button lengthens or widens the stitch. So the first pass will go with just the standard preset width, and we'll line the edge of the fabric up with the edge of the presser foot, and we're just going to zigzag the length of the seam. So we'll put it like this. Right? So this is a zigzag seam finish, and it will keep the threads from raveling. You want to trim all those off. The other option would be if you wanted a wider setting. So you would just widen the stitch, and it will wrap over. If you move the edge of the fabric in just a little bit from the edge of the presser foot, it will wrap around the edge of the edge of the fabric, and that changes it a little bit too. See a difference in how it wraps around those edges as opposed to this one where there's still frays right there. So that's the one option for the zigzag seam finish. Another option would be to go right down the middle of the seam allowance. And if you do this, sometimes on a sheer fabric, that's a good place to go, is just to zigzag it right down the middle. And you don't get, if you zigzag it and it goes over, sometimes it makes a ridge, and then you can see the ridge on the front of the fabric when you wear the garment. You can see like a little line down through there, and you don't want that. So this will keep the seam allowance flat, controlled under the presser foot, and then it will allow you to zigzag this. Then you would go back, and that's much flatter than it would have been if you'd done it close to the edge, but you can come back and then trim away the extra fabric, but it will lay flat and not show through on the front of your garment. So that's the zigzag seam finish. One last option for the zigzag seam finish is to put the 2 seam allowances together and zigzag the two all at the same time. And this will give you an appearance more like a serge seam finish if you don't have a serger. So I'm going to trim down the seam allowance to make it not so bulky. The disadvantage of doing this is if you were to need to let the garment out, you don't have any room to make the seam smaller. But what you would do is trim it down and then just put those two together, and you're going to sew just like we've been doing, and catch the edges as you go down through there. So 3 choices with the zigzagging, at least 3 choices with the zigzag seam finish. So that's how it looks when you finish and do both together. The second seam finish that we're going to look at is the stitched and pinked seam finish. And what I've done is just done a 5/8 inch seam, the length of the square. So this would be the same as if it was the inside of your garment. What you want to do is stitch right down the middle of the seam allowance with a straight stitch. So I'm going to go back and set my machine on 1, the standard stitch length, and I'm going to sew down the middle of the seam allowance. And this is going to show up better because it's a dark piece of fabric. All right. Clip the thing. You do the same thing on this side. Then you're going to take these pinking shears, and these are special scissors with a zigzag edge, and you're just going to trim away the seam allowance up to the line of stitches that you just did. So you're going to cut down through there, and voila. Now this will ravel a little bit, but by the time it ravels to the edge of the thread that you made the stitches with, it'll stop. So it will only ravel as far as that row of stitches. But it gives it a more decorative look than if you just cut off the seam allowance. So that's the stitch in pink, and I would just do the same thing on the other side. This is the serger. This is the machine that if you look on the inside of your ready-to-wear clothing, this is the machine that they would use to make the seam finishes that you see on ready-to-wear. A lot of people say this is a scary machine, and you want to practice on a scrap of fabric before you bring your garment to the serger, or probably even before you do your sample. So when you use the serger, you lift up the front edge of the presser foot and you slide the fabric in underneath. There is a blade you can see right here that's going to trim off whatever is to the right of the edge of the plate is going to be trimmed away. So if you set your fabric here, you're not going to have anything trimmed away, as opposed to if you set it here, it's going to trim off all of this right here. So you need to practice just to get a feel for where you need to hold the fabric, how you need to hold it, how fast it's going to go before you use this for real. So this is what it's going to do. Like, you see how it trims away the fabric. But if I scoot it over and do it right here, it does the same finish without trimming anything off, just the loose thread. And we'll look at the difference. So it finishes it and cuts it all at the same time. But here is where I was trimming some off, and then here is where I just had it going by the edge. It's a little bit loose, but we'll adjust that. So when you do your sample for the serge seam finish, you want to take your one square, cut it in half, do a 5/8 inch seam, and then you want to press that open to do the sample for your notebook. What you'll do is three different samples. The first one will serge each side of the seam allowance. This is a good idea if you know that this might be a garment that you need to let out or take up, because you can still pick out the seam, but you've got your seam finished. So kind of like the zigzag. So we're just going to go down through here, and I'm not going to trim very much off, so I've got it right there. And when you finish, you want to leave a tail and bring it up so that you can cut the threads off on the thread cutter over on the left-hand side. So that's what one side would do. And then you would just do the same thing on the other side. You would serge down through there. And you would end up, we'll do it. Lift it up. Goes kind of fast, you know, control the foot pedal. Do the tail, come up. All right, then we'll clip these tails off and have, ooh, it's really loose. You'll have a serge seam finish right there. So that looks nice and neat for the inside of your garment. The other option would be if you wanted, another option would be if you wanted to serge them together. So again, you wouldn't be able to let this garment out, but it's a nice neat finish, and it would be all in one. So you would just leave your two seam allowances side by side, and you would feed it through the serger. You might want to trim it off if you look at your ready to wear. Usually they're not a very wide seam, so you might want to scoot it over so that it does trim off a little bit. And you can line the thread up, the seam up, with the dot on the foot. It's another good way to judge that. So serge right down through there. What I would warn you about when you're working on the serger is making sure that all the fabric underneath is over to the left. What you don't want to happen is for something to get shifted just a little bit, and I'll show you what happens. It's always sad when this happens, but you're not paying attention, and I have serged my front of my sample or my dress or whatever into the seam allowance, and it cuts it off, and so when you pick it out, there's a hole, and that's always a sad day. So you have to be careful when you are serging to make sure everything is in its right place. Okay, we just looked at seam finishes. In the next video, we'll be looking at construction processes.